About the worst thing I've heard about is recently on Billy Graham Parkway, the atheists put up the sign out there that said, left out the words under God. Remember that? And somebody climbed up on that billboard and painted in the words under God. And we don't know who did that. As far as I know, they've never really found the people responsible for that. But immediately the assumption was it was Christians. That Christians got huge ladders and climbed up there and wrote under God on that billboard and defaced the atheistic billboard. Now I've got to tell you, whoever defaced that billboard, it was wrong to do that. We would all agree they were defacing public property. We understand that. That's not the way to get our message out, not by any stretch of the imagination. But for days and weeks after that event, I listened to talk radio, and also I watched the newspaper. I read the Charlotte Disturber, and I read all the editorials, and immediately people launched out against Christians. And they talked about Christians being pushy and forceful and forcing their views on everybody else. There was no tolerance. Zero. Zilch. Everybody assumed it was a Christian who had defaced this sign and put under God up there, and they had all kinds of bad things to say about Christians. Listen, folks, compared to the extremists in Islam who are bombing people and killing people in the name of Allah, we don't even come close. Even if we deface a billboard. And we don't know that it was a Christian. It could have been a prankster. It could have been a couple of teenagers. We don't really know who it was. But automatically the Christians were blamed for that incident. According to Genesis, the Middle East crisis and all the tension there revolves around two deities, two different gods. And Allah is not the same as Jehovah Yahweh. And here's another factor. According to Genesis, and Genesis puts first things first, the strife in the Middle East involves two descendants. Not just two deities, but also two descendants. Not only does Islam and Christianity have different gods, different deities, they also have a different interpretation of Abraham's life and his two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Now this forms the nucleus of our faith because we believe in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. But Islam believes that Ishmael is the promised son. And that formulates the very basis of their theology and what they're all about. In Genesis chapter 11, we are introduced to this man Abram, or Abraham, his name was later changed, for the very first time. And the Bible says that Abram lived originally in Ur of the Chaldees, in the Chaldean region of the world. That's the modern nation of Iraq. That's basically where he came from. He came from Iraq. And God called him out of Iraq to a land that he promised to him, but he didn't really tell him exactly where it was located. But he and his family were uprooted. They left Iraq, they left Ur of the Chaldees, and they went to a new land that God had promised to give to them and to their descendants forever. And that land turned out to be the Holy Land. That turned out to be Israel. And here's what God promised Abraham. I'll make of you a great nation. Isn't that something? That God's going to start a whole new nation. He's going to create a brand new nation. He's going to ordain a brand new nation through Abraham, through which his promises and purposes will be served. What an awesome prophecy. And yet there was one problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. They were childless. How in the world can you be the father of a nation if you can't even father one child? And yet that was the dilemma of Abraham and Sarah when God gave them this idea that they were going to have a son and they would have this land forever as their inheritance. So Abraham and Sarah got together and they decided, maybe we need to help God out. How many of you know that's a bad idea? Anytime we start thinking like that, maybe God needs my assistance. He's busy with all the problems of the world and everybody's praying at the same time. And maybe, Sarah, you and I just need to help God out. And here's what they came up with. Sarah said, well, I've got this handmaiden. She's an Egyptian. She comes from that Arabic culture. She's Egyptian. And I tell you what, her name is Hagar. Why don't we use her as a surrogate mom? Why don't we let her bear this child, and then we'll have a son, Abraham, kind of a son, stepson combination, but at least it'll be your son, and God can fulfill his promises through the son of Hagar. And that's exactly what happened. Hagar conceived, she became the surrogate mom, and she had a son by the name of Ishmael. Now after a while, Sarah got really upset when she saw this lady walking around expecting, because every time she saw that lady, she saw Hagar, great with child, it reminded her that she couldn't have a child. And every time she saw Hagar, Sarah was reminded, hey, that's my husband's child inside of another woman. Have you heard the expression, if mama's not happy, nobody's happy? I want to tell you, Sarah was not happy. And when Sarah was unhappy, nobody was happy in the tents of Abraham. And finally, Abraham had to say, Hagar, look, I think it'd be better if you'd go, and if you'd leave and take this child somewhere else. I'm sorry about all this, but I need for you to go because Sarah is the love of my life. I love her dearly, and I need to stay with Sarah. And he told Hagar, hit the road. In the King James, it's hit at the road. But basically, that's what he told her. And that created bitterness and deep frustration. Now, an angel, listen to this, an angel appears to Hagar and made a prediction, several prophecies about Ishmael, this firstborn son of Abraham. You'll find this in Genesis chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. I won't take time to read all of it to you, but let me just kind of surmise it for you. Genesis chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. Here's what the angel said. You have conceived and you will have a son. Well, that came to pass. You will name him Ishmael. Ishma means simply that God has heard. E-L on the end means God. God has heard. God has heard your prayers, and his name will be called God has heard. Ishmael. For the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. Then listen to this. The man will be a wild donkey. That's not very flattering, is it? This man's going to be a wild donkey. Doesn't mean he's democratic, just means he's a wild donkey, all right? In the truest, strictest sense of the word. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will live at odds with all of his brothers. That is, the descendants of Abraham, his brothers. He's going to be at odds with them, and he's going to be a man of turmoil. He's going to be a man of conflict. He's going to be a wild donkey. Now talk about revealing. Every word of that prophecy has come true through the descendants of Ishmael across the years. They are against their brothers through Abraham. Most of the world is kind of opposed to them. They're opposed to most of the world, at least the free world, and their hand is against others. Now there are two other predictions that the angel gave to Hagar about Ishmael. Number one, that he and his descendants would be a great nation. Are they? Yes. Many, many nations of the world are now Islamic. Go to France, and you'll see that it's largely Islamic. Huge pockets of Islam in the land of France and in other European countries as well. And Islam is creeping forward and taking over more and more countryside and more lands. And God said, through the angel, you will be a great nation. And then he also said this, you will live east of your brothers. Is that true? They are in the middle what? East. They are east of their brothers. These prophecies have absolutely come true. Now, ultimately, Ishmael became the father of the Arab people, the Islamic people. Now, we know that Abraham finally did have a supernatural son. When he was 100 years old, his wife was 90. So as you grow older, there's still hope if you want to have a child, all right? 100 years old. He has a baby. I imagine on the back of his chariot, he had a sticker that said this, I'm not a dirty old man, I'm just a sexy senior citizen. I believe that with all my heart. Abraham was a dad at 100, and his wife was 90. And God gave them a son 14 years after Ishmael was born, and this son was named Isaac. Now, because Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham, even though it was through an illicit relationship with Hagar, the Islamic people feel like that he should inherit all the privileges and all the rights thereof. That every promise that God gave to Abraham ought to belong to Ishmael and the descendants of Ishmael, which would be the Arab people. That includes possession of the land of promise. That's why they'll never be satisfied, even though Israel keeps giving up a little bit of the West Bank, a little bit more of the West Bank, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. They're not going to be satisfied. You know what they want? They want all of Israel. And in particular, they want Jerusalem. And they feel like they're entitled to it because Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham. And normally all the rights and privileges do come to the firstborn, but he's not really the firstborn of Abraham. And Sarah, that's the problem.